So when I went to seminary to learn the biblical languages, I technically learned how to read them. It took several years, several semesters, 4 or 5 classes of biblical languages to get a hang of how to read them. But even then, when I sat down and opened up my Hebrew Bible or my Greek New Testament, I would still find that I was reading very slowly. And I was looking at every individual word. And when I'd come across a verb, I just felt really compelled to parse it. And I would try to look for uh, patterns. I basically was analyzing the text as I was reading it. And occasionally I'd run into a word where I didn't know what the meaning was. And I would have to reach for my lexicon to find out what the meaning of that word was that I just couldn't remember. And of course, that just slowed me down even further. So technically, I was reading the text, but not in a natural way, not in the way I would read the language, my natural native language. And so it becomes very frustrating, very tedious, very tiring, and gets to the point, and I'm sure I share this with other people who have had the same experience, that you just give up on it. And so pretty soon, all you're doing when you encounter the Greek New Testament or the Hebrew Bible is you're just analyzing. You're maybe preparing a sermon or preparing to teach, and you're just doing enough reading to analyze. And I don't know that that can really be called reading. And so, really, to be honest, even after formal training at seminary, I wasn't ready to read. Hello, everyone. Shalom. Frank Hartman here from Biblical Mastery Academy. I want to take a moment with you today and talk to you a little bit about reading. And specifically, are you ready to read? Now, you might react and say, well, yeah, I'm ready to read. I read all the time. And I'm sure you do. But when we try to read biblical languages, we're presented with a little different situation than what we are normally when we're trying to read a newspaper. And many times, because of how we're taught or where we focus on learning the biblical languages, we really are not ready to read like we think we might be. Now, when I compare that to the way I read in my natural language, there's some really distinguishing features in the way I read my natural language. And that is, I read fairly rapidly, not speed reading, but I'm moving from word to word fairly quickly because I recognize the words. If I don't recognize a word, I'll look it up in a dictionary, and it'll be a dictionary that gives me an equivalent meaning in the same language, not a cross-language dictionary. Or many times I'll just get the meaning from context. I'll just infer the meaning of the word, even if I don't know the word directly. I can infer that from the context of the passage or paragraph or story I'm reading. I'm not grinding through the sentences. I'm not looking at every word and doing a parsing analysis of the word to be able to understand the meaning. It's flowing much more smoothly. And so by doing that as I'm reading, I'm creating a picture in my mind of the story that I'm reading about. And I'm placing characters in my mind, and I'm seeing who's doing what, who's saying what the action is, and how the story is flowing. That part is where reading comprehension is coming in. I'm comprehending what the author wrote, and I'm therefore transferring it into my cognitive understanding without taking the step of translating. And that is possible even when reading in translation. And so those are really two distinguishing factors in one way of reading that's more like analyzing, and the other way of reading, which is more comprehension, or what's known as reading for comprehension. Well, you might be asking yourself, how do I get to that point where I can read the biblical languages at least somewhat like I can read my native language? It may never get to the point where those are equal on par with one another, but certainly there can be improvement in reading the biblical languages. And so, what do we need to do to get to that point? In order for us to master reading with comprehension, it's going to require us to have a good fluent control of the language. What does that mean, fluent control? That doesn't necessarily have to mean fluency the way we usually think of that, in that fluency in a language means I can just, at a drop of a hat, speak to a native speaker perfectly, fully understandable, and being understood. That's not necessarily what that means. What it does mean, though, is that we are fluent or skilled enough with the language that we can read in such a way that we don't need to focus on the mechanics of the reading. And one of the steps that will really help achieve that goal is mastery of the vocabulary of the language. When we're reading in a biblical language, if we have to stop and look up every other word, that's not going to be very conducive to a good reading experience. We need to master the vocabulary such that we can, every once in a while, run into a word that we don't know, and if we can't derive the meaning of it from context, then we might have to access a lexicon. But that should be the rarity, not the norm. So vocabulary mastery is at the top of the list of accomplishing good reading. Another thing that we need to get used to and be comfortable with as readers of biblical languages is the courage to make errors and fail along the way as we read. So too many times we're so consumed with getting every word right because that's what we had to do perhaps when we were learning the language in seminary or some other means, that we feel like I can't move on unless I fully understand all of the grammar and syntax and semantics of that word, and then I can move on to the next one. But really, we should be able to read through a verse or a sentence and let context be our guide as to how accurately are we understanding the meaning of the words. If we've misinterpreted somehow a noun and it's not making sense anymore as we proceed, or we've misinterpreted the tense of a verb and we think it's in the past, but it turns out it should be in the present or future, and the context isn't making sense, then we can go back maybe and look and double check. But we shouldn't do a full analysis word by word as we're going through it. That's part of what slows us down and keeps us from reading with good comprehension. Another indicator we can look for in the biblical languages as we read them are the places where clauses start and end. If we can recognize the clausal structure of the biblical languages, then that'll help us read piece by piece, so that we might read a piece with some fluency and comprehend what that clause is saying, and then move on to the next clause. Not overanalyzing it, but enough so that we start to see these larger pieces fall into place and build that story in our mind. So that as we're picturing the narrative or the poetry that we're reading, we see a diorama in our mind of action and characters and speech going on, as opposed to getting stuck on grammar points and things like that. And the final point that can really help us be ready to read is community. Reading amongst others can really help us hone and polish our ability and our confidence in reading with speed, reading with a degree of fluency. And that's not always possible for everybody to read in a community. Maybe you don't have a local group of Greek or Hebrew readers that you can interact with. But there are so many online options to do that, to be a part of an immersive, communicative, learning community, whether you're learning in the natural language method or whether it's in the grammar translation method environment. Both are successful if done in a community. And Biblical Mastery Academy is such a community. I hope you found this information useful, and if you have your own reading experience, feel free to share it in the comments below. Was it positive? Was it negative? Do you feel stuck where you are in your reading? Are you ready to read better? Let us know. We'd be really interested to hear from you. So until we get a chance to speak again, shalom and take care.